We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
So we are here today with Rachel Kyte, who is the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. But that alone doesn't nearly go deep enough into your incredible career, Rachel. So welcome to the Energy Impact Podcast.
Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. So our listeners who might not be familiar with your career, you held sustainable development positions at the International Finance Corporation and the World Bank before becoming a special representative to the UN Secretary General and CEO of the Sustainable Energy for All organization. And we can't wait to dive into all of those amazing roles that you held, but I'd like to start a little farther back in your career and actually kind of start really at the beginning of what brought you into the world of sustainable finance and climate and energy.
Well, I grew up in the United Kingdom in the sort of 70s and 80s, and I think there was a whole discussion at that time around what did it mean to be European? What was the future of Europe? This is before we had the Maastricht Treaty and the European Union had been fully developed. And it was also a time when there was an Iron Curtain down the middle of Europe. But certain things transcended or went around or underneath that Iron Curtain, including the environment, the air you breathe, the water that we depend upon. And so environmentalism was a big part of sort of the peace discussion and a very big part of what it meant to be European or what Europe meant. And so while we were having mutually assured destruction sort of discussed over our heads between the Soviet Union and the United States, young people were sort of trying to work out, what kind of future we wanted. And so that was where my environmental sensitivity came from. And then I was very involved in youth politics in Europe at the time and ended up really being able to watch sort of political leaders that took the environment seriously, including Gro Harlem Brundtland and others, and got to work with them a little bit. And so really began to sort of understand the importance of sort of environment issues in politics and in development. And then I went on to sort of work on those issues, working on the gender elements of that as well, and working more globally in development. I think where the finance came into it was that when I was working in NGOs on environment and development issues, I worked for a series of very smart people. And Joan Dunlop, who I worked for actually at a women's health organization out of New York, said to me, Rachel, if you're really going to make a difference and you really understand how to change things, then you need to follow the money. And so I took that to heart and really decided that I needed to understand how that worked. And sort of then later on in my career, I ended up working on the first sort of arrangements for conflict resolution and management around large-scale private sector investments from the World Bank Group into developing countries. And that got me into the International Finance Corporation. But before I arrived there, understanding the flow of money, where it came from, how it moved and where it went to and for what and who made those decisions, that was sort of baked into me fairly early on.
Yeah, it sounds like you had some really great mentors to kind of help steer you towards, an area that not only were you passionate about, but something that is going to be an incredibly important area to understand and help create change and impact, especially now, given back then, when you were a youth, there was a lot of, great global challenges. But today, we face similar, if not even more daunting challenges in climate change and in this global energy transition. We're achieving these targets of net zero that I'm sure a lot of that kind of fundamental work that you were looking at in following the money, understanding different stakeholder motivations, understanding geopolitical tensions, really helped to kind of pave the way for new for your career going forward. So, I mean, can we maybe start with your career in the IFC? You know, I think it's a really fascinating organization that we have actually covered on this podcast before, but I'd love for you to kind of jump into, you know, some of the work that you did there. You were there for quite a number of years, and kind of what you focused on and how that prepared you for going into, you know, these other roles within the World Bank and eventually SEforAll, and now kind of in this advisory capacities that you find yourself in.
So I joined the IFC at the turn of the millennium, which seems such a long time ago. It makes me feel very old. But I joined the IFC really sort of, and I kind of joke about this, through the back door. In the late 1990s, as had preceded the IFC at the World Bank on the public sector lending side in the 1980s, there had been a series of very high-profile conflicts around major investments. And so in the case of the IFC, I think the one that caused the most angst and the most sort of storm and fury was an investment, a 3% equity stake in in Endesa, and a series of dams that Endesa was going to be building in Chile on the Biobío River, halfway sort of down Chile, above Concepcion. And people were resettled or were to be resettled, land was to be acquired. I mean, the usual things that go with a large-scale infrastructure development, but infrastructure at that time was moving into places where infrastructure hadn't been built before. And we saw a series of complaints around large mines, large infrastructure, dams, toll roads, these kinds of things. And these were also at that point, for the first time, you were seeing private equity moving in, you were seeing large-scale private investment in these kinds of activities. And there was no recourse, and there was no real sense of whose voice could be heard, and who had what rights and who needed to be consulted. And so Jim Wolfenson at that time was the president of the World Bank, and he said, look, we've got to have some way of managing all of these conflicts. And so there was a process of consultation, and advisors were brought together. And it was suggested that for the IFC and MEGA, so for the private sector lending and the private sector guarantee and entities of the World Bank Group, it would be more interesting or more useful to have an ombuds service, so that those who were affected could file complaints, and that the focus would be on conflict management rather than a sort of judicial process of blame. And so I was asked to join the Office of the Ombudsman. The first Ombudsman was Dame Meg Taylor, who's just stepped down recently as the Commissioner of the Pacific Island Forum. She was from Papua New Guinea, got a long history of managing conflicts around large mines. She was very involved in Bougainville, etc. And so I, together with Meg, I helped set up the Office of the Ombudsman. And for the first 4 years there, really mediated disputes around large-scale investments. That included IFC's equity in the Yanacocha gold mine in Peru, in Antamina, which was a mine in the high altiplano, but also mines in Tanzania, dams in Uganda, toll roads in Panama, things like that. And what happened is in the course of those 4 years, it became very clear that the safeguard policies that the World Bank was using, the environment and social safeguards, were written for public sector lending. They weren't written for private sector lending. And so Peter Voyker, who at that time was the CEO of IFC, asked if our office would run a sort of an analysis or an assessment of whether these policies were working or not and what we needed to do differently. We came back and sort of said they actually fit the business model very awkwardly. And so he actually, I think I had coffee with him, and he said, we're going to need a new director of our Environment and Social Development Department. That department is going to have to take this report and decide what to do with our safeguards. You should apply. And I was like, well, I was a long way from being director level. And anyway, so I threw my hat in the ring. I got the job. And then for the next really 3 years, together with an extraordinary team of specialists at the institution, we ran a very, very large scale consultation process and a very large scale sort of analytical process, and drafted the IFC performance standards, which then formed the basis for the Equator Principles. And for the first time, private banking, project finance, really using environment and social performance standards in its lending. And so, yeah, that was the journey.
I'm curious kind of what you saw in those analyses and just in your experience kind of helping the IFC transition in this way. What the differences you discovered really between public sector financing and private sector financing, kind of if you kind of explain for our audience, really where private sector financing has a really critical, maybe different role to play as opposed to government and international financing projects.
So I think that's an important point, is that, decades beforehand, if there was any large infrastructure, it was going to be built. It was going to be built by the public sector, and it was going to be built by loans from the World Bank or from a regional development bank to the government, and then the government was going to be contracting with maybe private entities or others to build these things, but they were going to be run off the public sector's rules. And the role of the government then would be different than the role of a purely private sector deal. And so when you think about how the private sector performs, then it needs to meet the needs of its shareholders. It needs to understand the needs of its stakeholders and meet the needs of its stakeholders. And it needs to actually understand who they are. Mm-hmm. And then the lender to the private sector was increasingly, I think we'd come through a decade of sort of extraordinary activism by civil society going after the banks who lent to the palm oil companies in Indonesia, to the forestry and pulp and paper mill companies of the West. And so you'd had Rainforest Action Network going after Citibank for its lending. You'd had the palm oil people going after ABN AMRO for its activities in Indonesia, etc. So investors and banks were increasingly being held to account for what was the environment and social activities of the projects and of the companies that they financed. This was all very, very new. Mm-hmm. So if your end goal is to achieve a development impact, then understanding that a large, rich infrastructure investment coming into a very poor part of the world is in and of itself going to cause social tension. So you're going to have contractors coming into perhaps an area of Nigeria in the north where there is no industrial activity, where there is no infrastructure, and they're going to build the infrastructure for the project, and there's going to be a fence around that. And then people are going to start moving to live outside the fence because they're going to be selling Coke and tea and other services, including sexual services, to the people working behind the fence, right? And suddenly you have a village growing up, and suddenly you have an infrastructure, and suddenly you have communicable diseases, and suddenly you have, a need for education for the kids of the workers. Mm-hmm. And so you have to understand how much of that responsibility lies with the firm and with the investors in the firm. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, environmentally, you're going to build an aluminum smelter in the middle of Cameroon or in the middle of Guinea or something like that. Then what is the responsibility of the company to A, understand the biodiversity of the area, B, understand the impact on the biodiversity, C, where is the limits of the private sector's responsibility and ability to mitigate, manage, or avoid any of those impacts. And so we were really, we were trying to put guardrails and rules and best practice in place to, first of all, avoid impacts where they could be avoided, where they couldn't be avoided, to mitigate and to then manage. And I think the bar was constantly moving, and the bar continues to move to today. So I currently chair the Health and Safety Economic and so Environmental and Social Committee of the Private Infrastructure Development Group. And today, we've got gender-based violence advice to entities that we invest in, because gender-based violence carried out by the contractors that are employed, is a significant issue, there's much more awareness about that now. And then secondly, of course, we have policy around climate impacts in a much more detailed way than we did 20 years ago. So that bar is always moving.
And is this type of kind of advisory service that the IFC does for these large international projects, is this something that, served a role that previously was completely unserved, especially, in these, Western countries or more rich countries kind of coming into, other countries that don't have the infrastructure? And how maybe, I guess I'm curious, how have some of these after several years of this type of work being very successfully, shepherded by international organizations, how has infrastructure, social infrastructure, political infrastructure, maybe changed in some of these areas to not rely so much necessarily on these, international organizations, but actually ensure that there's these same safeguards and guardrails up, in the local area as well?
Well, so I think that for many, it's a very good question. For many years, the IFC and the World Bank had they would produce the environmental health and safety guidelines, and it's like a volume that was so thick that you could hold a church door open with it, right? And in there was every guideline and every standard that you needed to meet in your environmental impact assessment, etc. I think what then I think was very smart about the IFC was that as it iterated the performance standards, and in the conversation with the leading banks at the time that became the first Equator Principles banks, was that these standards, well written and well understood, and with sort of training behind them and sort of products and services in support of them, would become a norm and a standard that everybody else could use. And actually the way to have development impact was not to have these used by the IFC, but was to have these used by all multilateral development finance and then used by private finance as well. And I think that went very, very quickly, and that really became, and then in 2008, 2009, the bottom fell out of project finance and the great financial crisis. And then sort of coming back from that, the question is about making these standards sort of comprehensive. So if you're an investment bank, obviously you should use these standards for your project finance, but what standards are you adhering to when you provide investment advisory services? What standards are you adhering to when you are engaged in an equity fund or other forms of finance, or if you're providing equity, not project finance? So what you've seen now, I think, is a blossoming of sort of what is the standard for environment and social best in class or best practice, across all financial instruments. And so I think that's where it is now. Now, when I look at the IFC, I think that the shareholders have put a lot of pressure on the multilateral development banks in the last few years. And in some respects, you've seen the IFC retreat a little bit from its advisory role and concentrate on the lending. I think that global public goods role is essential. It has to be financed by somebody, because it has to be available to the countries that need it most, and they're not going to buy those services off the shelf from an ERM or a McKinsey or anybody else. I mean, so I think that there is a role always for the Bretton Woods institutions in that upstream advisory capability, so that the government knows how to regulate the private sector and the private sector knows how to behave in countries where you've got a weak regulatory environment. But now when I think about it, and I think about where the future is, then you would want to see the IFC playing an extremely robust role in helping companies operating in post-conflict countries and weak governance environments in the developing world, in terms of what is best practice in zero net emissions, what is best practice in all forms of air pollution that would apply both to climate outcomes but also to air quality outcomes. What is the best in-class advice now around the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples and human rights, etc. I mean, so it is the responsibility, I think, of the IFC as a publicly held institution to keep on pushing back the boundary of understanding and then making that understanding available to everybody.
Yeah, I would love to kind of move a little bit forward in your career and talk about the World Bank and your work there, where you were, the special envoy on climate change. A lot of the topics you were just mentioning are just so broad in terms of, the range of areas that we're focusing on in terms of infrastructure and project development, from, women empowerment to environmentalism. How did climate change start to become kind of that? I mean, climate change touches all of those things, right? And we'll get to that when we speak, obviously, about the SDGs as well. But how did climate change start to become kind of a special focus area for you when you did go to the World Bank?
So we were looking at climate change when I was at the IFC. I was vice president of the Business Advisory Services. The environment and social work continued under my vice presidency. So I was seeing what we were doing. And we started to think about a world where we would need to mitigate climate change, and a world where carbon was going to become a problem. This is before stranded assets had been defined. But we started doing some very early regressions on the portfolio, really looking to see, if we put prices on carbon, what would that do? If we started to work on internal prices and internal cost of carbon, what would that do to performance of the portfolio of individual deals? We started to look at, and so this was sort of internal work. We started to look at within the environment, health and safety guidelines, what kind of emissions we would want to see and the performance of different technologies from an emissions point of view. So this was really starting, and this is before Copenhagen. So Copenhagen was the 2009 failed, quote unquote, climate talks. And so I think that there it was really about, the mindset there was really about driving efficiency in use of energy. If companies could be more efficient in the use of energy, then that was, and water, that was going to stand them in good stead. There was fairly clear evidence from our looking at the portfolio that if a company was really performing to a high environment and social standard, they were normally performing well financially. And then we were trying to look at, well, if they're not performing well financially, do they poorly perform environmentally and socially? And often yes, because if you're not doing well financially, you're not investing in your environment and social performance. And there was fairly clear evidence that environment and socially weak performers, just weren't on top of their game, and therefore that was reflecting them in their financial performance. But it was in 2000. Sorry.
Was that true kind of across the globe, or were there specific areas where those trends didn't play out?
No, I think it was true across the globe. But it had less impact in many emerging markets where there's no civil society chasing you, transparency is not embedded, and you don't have you don't have investors maybe asking the same kinds of questions. And so I think as an investor in emerging markets, that those push and pull factors that were sitting as very much the environment for a Western oil and gas company or whatever, you didn't have that in the same way. So in 2011, the World Bank was struggling to agree a new energy policy, and this was at that time there was still a vibrant debate about are we about poverty eradication, or are we about climate change? They were seen as two entirely separate things.
Interesting.
And so there was a real discussion about we are a development bank and our job is development, and therefore climate has no part of all of this. And at the level of the board, you had sort of large middle-income countries and developing countries sort of saying, we don't want any rules that are going to impinge upon the bank's ability to lend to the things that we want to have the lending for. And so this was becoming very problematic. And Bob Zellick, who was then the president of the bank, asked me if I would move over from IFC to the bank and take over the portfolio of sustainable development, where energy was one of the sectors that would be under my management. And this was unusual at the time because very few people moved from the bank to IFC or from the IFC to the bank. That's a little less so now, but then it was very, very, very rare. And so I moved across, and the way in which we were able to square this, and you can imagine that we, at that point, we had sort of a Europe and the United States then under President Obama really sort of pushing hard on more climate action. And then we had, we did not yet have the sort of dance between China and the US, the partnership that they formed before Paris.
Yeah.
And so you had sort of China, India, Saudi Arabia, all lined up with sort of saying, we want lending for everything. So the way in which we squared that was that the UN had just brought together under the auspices of Ban Ki-moon a lot of different actors around a concept of what is the energy agenda from a development perspective. Ban Ki-moon, when he came in as the Secretary General of the UN, was quite intrigued as to why energy was not considered as a development issue in the UN, because he'd grown up in Korea, as a young man with only a candle to do his homework by. And so this was a very personal thing for him. So he brought together leading international organization heads and private sector heads, including Chad Holliday, who went on to become the chairman of Shell, and others, around something called Sustainable Energy for All. And the bank became a partner in that. Sustainable Energy for All said, look, you need to conceive of this as three things. They went on to become the Sustainable Development Goal, but this is predating that. And those three things were that everybody should have access to energy. That energy should be, in the end, it was described as modern, sustainable, etc. I mean, today we understand that to be clean, right? But so everybody has access to energy. We should have much more energy efficiency, and we should have much more renewable energy in the mix. So what I was able to do is say, look, all of you countries have agreed this framework at the United Nations. Saudi Arabia, you agreed this at the UN. China, you agreed this at the UN. And so why don't we use that as the framework for the energy forward directions or strategic directions paper? And then
predating the SDGs. This is the formation.
Yes, this is 2011. Yeah, this is 2011, early 2012, before the SDGs were even conceived of. At that time, the idea that there would be SDGs had not really come forward. That came forward out of the Rio summit in 2012. So then the big issue was coal, even then. And so the framing at that point that we managed to get an agreement on is that we would only invest in coal in very rare circumstances. And honestly, even at that point, the very rare circumstances were going to be a large discussion around Kosovo, where there was this ancient lignite burning power station that was really filthy, and the most dangerous and sort of disgusting power plant on the continent. And the replacement for that was going to be what? At that point in time, most people did not believe you could jump from that to fully renewable energy. You would have to jump from that to a cleaner lignite burning power station, right? So is that an emergency circumstance because there is no other viable alternative? So these were the kinds of deals where nobody wanted to say never. Right. And so that was the language that was agreed. And then there had been some recent investments in coal-fired power in South Africa. Again, at that point, they had been first invested in like 2009-10, and they were considered to be really significantly important for South Africa's political future. Now. Sort of just 12 years on, right? They now look increasingly like white elephants, but coal is still an incredibly difficult part of the just transition in South Africa.
Right, because when you're trying to balance energy access and clean energy, you have to make some tough choices. Because not everywhere has sun shining and the wind blowing. Not everywhere has, nuclear energy capabilities. And some places just need to build power so that they can feed their people and they can grow their economies. It's something that we at EIC look at all the time. It's very much a rational decision, whether, it seems unintuitive, but it's a rational decision to build dirty energy if that's all you have access to, right? So I think, this notion of bringing together, the need for increasing energy access and stating that energy needs to be clean is really important to start thinking about so early on, as those two going hand in hand, because you can't just have one or the other in all cases. So I think it's really, really great to hear.
Yeah, it wasn't really until I think in 2015, in early 2015, the stranded assets report first came out from Carbon Tracker. And that really shifted the debate in a very profound way, because it was, there is a limit to, first of all, there's a planetary limit to how many emissions we can put on out there that won't, before we run out of sort of a carbon budget. And then this really was sort of saying, look, and the financial cliff that everybody's going to drive off if they're holding carbon when it loses its value so that really started to sort of penetrate consciousness, I think, on the private sector side, the long-term investors. And of course, as the World Bank Group, you are a long-term investor, but you're also the investor of last resort in some cases. So it should be understood that the World Bank Group would hold more carbon in its portfolio because, if anybody's going to do those emergency deals, then it should be the World Bank Group. But increasingly, the debate moved to, if we're in the business of development, then that development has to be clean, and we have to find and mobilize the resources for countries to make the quicker transition to clean energy. Now, I have to say that the coal lobby ran a very aggressive campaign for a number of years, and that you started to see these ads in, like, I never forget, sort of, in the FT or on the FT online and elsewhere, sort of, so, basically, coal is the answer to energy poverty. It's the cheapest way to get energy to people. And when I was at SEforAll, I mean, this was like nonsensical once we started really building up a picture of who are the people who don't have access to energy. And around about that time, so this would be 2015, 2016, it was about 1 billion people in the world who didn't have access to energy. They were mainly living underneath the power lines and beyond the power lines in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, small island states, etc. And I think we calculated that about 80% of the people who didn't have any access to energy were living in sort of 16 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, building centralized coal-fired power and then having somebody finance the transmission lines out all the way to sort of far-flung rural parts of the Sahel, made no sense economically. It was never going to be done politically because there's not enough votes in those sparsely populated parts of the Sahel. And so, of course, at that time, you'd already started to see this extraordinary revolution in the price collapse of renewable energy, the beginning of the price collapse of storage, and the fact that renewable energy could be provided in a distributed way, in a decentralized way. And so that kind of changed the debate. But now we see the same debate again with the gas industry, whose markets are shrinking in the developed world, saying, hey, Africa still has 600 million people without access to energy. Gas is the answer. I think, again, people would argue that actually, if we can mobilize the financing, then the cheapest way to close that energy access gap may be by going fully renewable. But the onus is on the developed world to provide the support and the assistance to countries to be able to do that quickly.
Yeah, actually, speaking of kind of the developed world and the role that the developed world is playing in kind of the transition to clean energy, addressing climate change, let's actually take a step back, if you don't mind, and talk a little bit about the SDGs and how SEforAll kind of fits within SDG 7, but kind of overall how SDG 7, which is the one that's focused on clean energy, fits within kind of the broader framework for sustainable development, and what all of these countries have kind of signed up to in this framework that addresses climate, but also does it in a way that, again, going back to kind of those broad topics that you discussed earlier, empowers women, encourages education, et cetera. If you could kind of just give us an overview of the SDGs and kind of how energy plays a role in achieving the entire suite of them.
So the Sustainable Development Goals were the successor to the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals, which had sort of run from the millennium to 2015, had really been, not to put too fine a point on it, sort of written on the back of an envelope by a bunch of guys in a small room in Paris, right?
Isn't that how everything works?
That's how everything used to work. And so the SDGs became this extraordinary, like, crowdsourcing. There was an expert panel with David Cameron and the president of Indonesia and president of Liberia and other dignitaries, but then the process was thrown back to sort of the General Assembly at the UN, and led by extraordinary diplomats from Kenya and from Ireland. And the whole world had a view, right? Business was consulted, civil society was engaged in all these countries. And there were sort of 17 goals, but what was really important was that from the get-go, there was no argument that energy would be a goal. But energy was not one of the Millennium Development Goals, and that's what had really puzzled Ban Ki-moon. And so these 17 goals emerged, and really SDG was considered one of the golden threads. So it is difficult to imagine how you can have access to high quality education for all if you're sitting in a classroom which is dark and which can't be connected to the internet because there's no electricity. It's difficult to imagine how you can achieve your health outcomes if a nurse can't practice her vocation because she can't get access to a clinic with the lights on, where the electricity goes out 26, 27 times a day, and a doctor can't practice, or you can't keep medicines and vaccines cool and safe. It's difficult to imagine how you can achieve SDG 2, which talks about zero hunger, if you can't have a cold chain for food, which you need energy for. And I could go on, right? So every single one of those goals, is intimately connected to the ability to have energy systems that work for everybody, energy systems which are clean and don't cause us a planetary problem for climate change, and energy systems which are hyper efficient and allow us to use to do more things with less energy, right?
Absolutely.
And so the good news was that in the period of sort of 2011 to 2015, a program called Sustainable Energy for All had sort of grown up out of this expert group that Ban Ki-moon put together. This concept of these 3 pillars of sustainable energy, so access, efficiency, and renewables, that had kind of been cemented in the imagination, and the private sector had gotten very involved early on. And so when the SDGs were agreed in, with Shakira on stage and everybody agreeing very quickly in September 2015, sustainable energy for all as an idea was already cemented in the public consciousness, and it was off to the races. And then Ban Ki-moon sort of said, look, this needs to be set up outside of the UN. We need to have this as a platform for the public and the private sector together. And that's how SEforAll, the organization, was born in 2016. But I think that we got a lot of running room as a result. And of course, now SEforAll continues to push forward on the boundaries of understanding of what this means. So SEforAll continues to work on getting energy to healthcare systems, even more important at a time of pandemic, how to make sure that refugees and the displaced have access to energy, and actually in providing the last mile with energy that you can serve other people more effectively. Issues around cooling, sustainable cooling and sustainable heating, things that often get forgotten. Everybody gets very excited about electricity generation, but there are many things that you need energy for which aren't about generating electricity. And then, of course, one of the most intractable problems is the fact that we still have about more than 2.5 billion people in the world, mainly women, who can't get access to clean fuels for cooking. And there are lots of reasons for that. So the agenda keeps moving forward, and the energy access agenda becomes a fundamentally important element of the leave no one behind part of the climate puzzle. So yeah, it remains a golden thread.
And so SEforAll kind of sits, on its own, but kind of in between, the UN and the World Bank, and ensuring that these, the 3 targets underneath SDG 7 that's focused on energy, are being met, are on track or not. I wonder if you could kind of explain kind of what the relationship between SEforAll and all the work that you just mentioned, and then tying back to the UN and World Bank really is. And then, kind of the role of it being almost more like a watchkeeper, making sure that we're holding ourselves accountable to meeting these targets, these goals by, I believe the deadline, or not deadline, but the target is to meet some of these goals by 2030. How SEforAll tries to ensure that these goals are at top of mind across these organizations, across different nations and sustainable development organizations as well. I wish you could kind of speak to where SEforAll creates that impact and keeping the focus on this goal?
So SEforAll is a unique partnership between the UN and the World Bank, and then that partnership extends out to the private sector. And I think one of the really strong aspects of sustainable energy for all is that you're as likely to be working with like a big global company like Danfoss, for example, as you are with a small off-grid provider in Sierra Leone, run by women. So it's everybody in between. There've been 3 heads of SEforAll. The first head of SEforAll was Candy Keller, who had been the head of UNIDO and took on SEforAll in those early stages. And he was the world's greatest salesman. He got the entire world enthusiastic about the concept of sustainable energy for all. I took over after him, and what I had to do at that point was keep that enthusiasm going, but then really define a critical path. These were not 3 completely independent ideas: access, efficiency, and renewables. They actually achieve together. So you need to be hyper efficient. You need to really drive renewable energy in order to achieve access for all. We can't have access achieved by coal and then have renewable energy for the 1%, etc. So that critical path really led us to doing much more work on how much is this going to cost? Who are the people who need the access? What kind of access do they need? How much energy do they need? What's that going to cost, and where's the funding going to come from, and why is the funding not flowing, given that everybody's agreed to this agenda? So we did a lot of that building blocks and brought in the conversation around the last mile, around refugees, and sort of these critical inflection points in that critical path. Mm-hmm. And now Damilolo Ogunbaye has taken over from me, who's a phenomenal leader, previously with the renewable rural energy agency in Nigeria. Her task then is to make sure that implementation is moving at scale, right? Because mm-hmm. we're now into this final 9 years of the SDGs, and we need to have much more progress in order to then be able to achieve all the other things. And of course, I think there's a renewed focus on the energy transition because of the urgency and the immediacy of the climate crisis. And so, I think SEforAll, and also because the head of SEforAll is a special representative for the Secretary General if he so chooses, you are able to use the UN's convening power, but you're also agile enough to be able to convene on the private sector side. And so you sit in toggling between the public and private sector, bringing people together with convening capability, but then really good analytical work, and then really strong advocacy, and then trying to make sure that those who have the opportunity to implement and to build things are connected in, and that the people who are supposed to be providing the finance can see, where that finance is needed and what the opportunities are. So it's a marketplace, it's a convener, it's a platform for extraordinary advocacy, both and diplomacy, really. So it's a new hybrid form of sort of governance around an idea. We see similar entities around, for example, vaccines, Gavi. Mm-hmm. You see similar sort of public-private platforms created around forest use and land transformation, follow, etc. And so increasingly we see these public-private models emerging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's just so, it's so great to have an organization that's kind of focused on, what are the drivers that we need to be pushing on to ensure that, there is ambition around achieving these goals. There's investment to achieve these goals. And there's also, we're holding ourselves to actually making real progress on this. I wanted to bring up an article that you recently wrote in your current role, where you're discussing entities that are launching these net zero PR campaigns and the need to take concrete actions to actually reduce emissions. I'm curious kind of what you see both private and public entities doing in this space to achieve these goals kind of outside of the SEforAll framework, and where we can continue to drive progress and encourage ambition in both the private and the public sector.
So we're at a very, very interesting point in the journey towards a sort of more sustainable future, in that what started off as what was considered completely outlandish in 2013 and 2014, the idea of net zero as a sort of goal, right? And even the arguing for 1.5 degrees as before the Paris Agreement asked the IPCC to come back with a report about whether 1.5 was feasible or not. I remember sitting in meetings with colleagues from different walks of life, and we were talking about, campaigning around net zero and whether that was outlandish or not. Or here we are, 2020, 2021, and net zero is the gold standard now, not just for the leading green companies in the world, but it's now for central bank governors, for finance ministers, for investors, for energy companies, right? So
governments like the
and for governments, right? So everybody's committing to net zero by 2050. The question is, how do they think they're getting to net zero? Those need to be science-based commitments, and we're seeing some science-based commitments which add up, some science-based commitments which don't, and some where science is really just free-floating concept, right? So we've got the good, the bad, and the ugly. So now what we need to do is put guardrails on this race to zero, because it's very important from an investor perspective, it's very important from the public's perspective, but it's critically important from the planet's perspective that this is actually real. So we do actually need to be, zeroing out emissions. There is a limit to how much I can continue to emit over here, and you're going to offset it over there, whether you're a forest in Malawi or whether you're a direct air capture company in Iceland, or actually it's false accounting, right? So one of the things that I'll be doing together with others, many others, is looking at, what are those roles? How do we start to put guardrails around what is at the moment a voluntary market and a voluntary initiative? Now, the race to zero is embedded in the Marrakesh Declaration and therefore has UN ownership. But the UN has a vested interest in making sure that if you're making a net zero commitment, that it's real, that it actually can be scientifically backed up, and if you're going to use offsets, that those are permanent, that those are identifiable, measurable, verifiable, etc. So we really are at a new era of international governance, and we don't have the institutions to do this. We don't have the rules for it. So we are basically inventing this as we run, right? So and that's both exciting. It's a little scary, but there is a responsibility then on everybody we have to hold each other to account.
Yes.
Because we've only got one planet, and if we get this wrong, the only people we will hurt is ourselves. And so there's a lot at stake in the next few years.
I think you said that beautifully. You mentioned, we don't have the international framework, we don't have the international guidebook, but we are seeing certain, entities take action. Last week we saw, I guess 2 weeks ago, we saw some landmark actions being taken in the Netherlands against Shell, which is potentially going to set precedent for a lot of other actions of this consequence. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, government kind of holding a large, polluting company to account, and how this might impact other industries, how it might influence other governments, or even be a potential, lesson learned for how the international community might look at this type of action going forward.
So there's so many layers to that. It's a fantastic question. There's so many layers to that. I mean, first of all, there's, I think that for some of the leading oil and gas companies that are listed in the West, right, there's a little feeling of like that they are clearly leading in the way in which they think about how they will manage the transition and how they manage themselves out of the oil and gas business effectively over the next few decades, and that they're getting clobbered by public opinion and investors and now by the courts, even though they're the leaders, when you compare them with the sort of the performance of maybe some of the other companies in their class, and then the national oil companies of many countries where there is just no pressure on them yet because they're publicly owned to to sort of come forward with the same kinds of science-based net zero commitments that Shell or BP or Equinor or Total are doing. So there's that piece of it. Second, some of these companies have come out with different ways to get to net zero. And I think they all, however, rely extraordinarily on offsets, whether that's nature-based solutions or nature-positive activities, or then direct air capture and elsewhere. And I think that, there is this catch-up that we have to do with, we only have a certain amount of nature that can be used to offset in this way, and then that nature has to be there permanently. You can't go and cut it down for other purposes and things like that. So that voluntary market and those rules need to be further cemented. And so, for Shell to say that it can get to net zero objectively by offsetting it, well, that's fine. But if Malawi's forests have already been used to offset, all these other activities, then how do we make sense of that? Right. So those are issues around the sort of way in which we achieve net zero. And then I think the courts, this is going to become an increasing feature. Of course, there had been a prior case in the Netherlands where Agenda and other civil society organizations working with members of the Dutch public had, sued the Dutch government for a climate plan that wasn't protective of its people. And so that they argued that the government wasn't protecting its people by coming up with a not ambitious enough climate plan. So, and that was one, and it was appealed and then appealed again, and the people won that case, right? And so the Dutch were forced to come back with a much more ambitious climate plan. So that you've got a bit of a precedent of using the courts. This case was very important because it's the first time that the courts have actually said, no, your plan is not in line with the science. Your plan is not in line with the objective of 1.5 or with the government's objectives, and therefore you've got to go away and correct it. Now, you could expect to see other cases like that then across Europe. I think the US is in a different place. But in the same week that happened, you had this extraordinary shareholder action on Exxon's board, where you've now got 3 independent directors on the Exxon board, all put there by a very small private equity firm, Engine Number One, and other activism. And then you also saw shareholder action really forcing Chevron to up its game as well in terms of its ambition. This is all made possible by the fact that these companies are performing very badly from a financial point of view. So you've got this coming together of the fact that we are now in an era of rapid decarbonisation. And therefore, if you're in the business of digging stuff up that is full of carbon, you have got to explain how you are going to stop it from emitting anything. So these are not oil and gas companies anymore, and they're not energy companies, as Total has now rebranded itself. They're actually carbon molecule companies, right? You can be in the business of digging these molecules up, but you cannot let them escape. Their emissions may not be allowed to escape.
Yeah, that's so well said. And while that is their business, right, they also have greater resources in many cases than some governments do to change their business. And I think that's a really kind of fascinating thing to think about, when we're looking at who's going to be, not just who needs to take action and really help to accelerate this transition, but who can take impactful and bold action, right? Given infrastructure, given financing, and given, pressure or momentum as well. As we kind of wrap up the episode, Rachel, I'd love to kind of let you just opine upon, your kind of thoughts going forward as to, what you see the most critical things in this space going forward as we look to, keeping up the ambition, trying to reach these SDGs, reach these energy and broader goals in the next 9 years, and what you're going to be keeping your eye on as we look forward to hopefully a much more sustainable and clean future.
Well, that's a really great question. I think the SDG is really important because we tend to get distracted by sort of incremental improvement over where we are now, and that's not going to be enough. And so we must always remember that the question in front of us is, how do we ensure that everybody has access to the energy they need to be productive in the economy, to be productive in life, right? and that energy be clean and it be affordable, right? And it be reliable, right? So that's what we're trying to achieve. Now, to get there, then we need to deploy the technologies that help you do that are available, but which aren't deployed at scale now. We need new technologies and new business models, and which there needs to be much more investment in than there is now. But I think we've had this big spat over the last few weeks about, how much of the technology we need is actually available, or we've got to invest in the truth of the matter is that we need much more R&D than we are spending at the moment across a whole phalanx of things related to sustainable food, water, and energy, right? So governments need to do more. And then we need to align the finance so that we're not doing stupid things with the public money that we have, and that public money is leveraging private money into places it won't go on its own. So that means that every multilateral development bank, every development finance institution needs to be absolutely in line with the 1.5 and with climate and with the SDGs. So that has to happen. And then the private sector finance can be mobilized. But this is not a development project. So it's not about development finance. This is about allowing countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America to have access to the capital markets at reasonable rates. This is about bond issues which aren't neutral, and that we understand that we do want green bonds, and brown bonds are not something that we want. This is about sort of Marshall Plan-sized ambition around revolutionizing energy markets, electricity markets. And this is about electrifying everything, right? Mm-hmm. So with clean electricity. So the thing to take home is this is entirely possible. Is it an enormous task? Yes. Is it daunting? Yes. Is it beyond us? No. But our politics need to support our science.
Well said. Thank you so much, Rachel. This has been so wonderful to talk to you. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, thank you. It's been great to talk to you too.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.